Greetings, YouTube. Recently, I put up a video comparing the glaive and the halberd to each other in 5th edition and was baffled by the fact that the rules essentially treat them the same. And in that video, I erroneously stated that the halberd should really be able to be doing a trip attack. Unaware of the fact, because I didn't notice it when I read the rules, that there is no trip attack in 5th edition unless you're very high and using like the Battle Master ability or something like that. Um, and someone left a comment, and in the comment they mentioned that I was, there is no trip attack, which kind of confused me. But they also made a statement that even though, it's missing certain things, the game is simpler and more approachable to new players. Now, this content of this video is not a critique of that person. He's entitled to his opinion. I have absolutely no anger against the person. I hope he comments on every gaming video I make. But he just inspired this video. You see, when I hear somebody say that they're happy that a system is simpler, what I'm hearing is that they agree with the assumptions of the game, that the assumptions the game makes and the assumptions they have about that set of rules, the mechanics and such, mesh. So they don't notice what is or isn't present because their assumptions click, chink, they fit together, they're happy. But you see, one of my assumptions was that the trip attack would never ever be removed from the rules, because it makes no sense to me. Now, one of the first things I think about when you say a trip attack is the wolf. Great sidekick for a druid, great for team attacks, because while the wolf is attacking and tripping your opponent, you can then bash them silly while they're falling on the ground. And it is a good emulation of how wolves actually function in the real world as a pack. Now, 5th edition has a pack attack, which replaces the trip attack, and for wolves, that makes perfect sense. The pack attack emulates the same kind of pack tactics that the trip attack did in 3.5 and Pathfinder 1st edition. But it isn't being translated to humanoids. So the humanoid suddenly just, boink, there is no trip attack, unless you are a high-level fighter. That's a bit of a corner case. And that really baffled me, because trip attacks are really common, and lots of polearms are specifically designed to facilitate them. And if you look at the manuals that were written in the Middle Ages, the period that we are kind of pseudo-emulating in high fantasy games, trip attacks were right there in the manuals, mostly polearms. But I have seen an illustration of a guy in full plate holding a greatsword by the blade so he could use the guard to trip his opponent. So trip attacks were common. Deleting them from the game makes no sense to me. So there we have an example of my assumption that the game would never lose them, and 5th edition saying, well, yes, in fact, we would. So this is an example of how I'm not clicking with the assumptions the game is making and the assumptions I'm making. I have argued for quite a few years now that regardless of the mechanics of a game, every single game has the same number of rules. What do I mean by that? That the assumptions we bring to a game, the assumptions of what you can and can't do with your character's body and within the narrative of the world that you live in, whether it's cyberpunk or goofy science fiction or the Middle Ages or the Old West, that comes with a set of things that you assume you will be able to do in that setting. If you're in an Old West, you assuming you could have a gunfight, and the rules should allow you to have a gunfight that is satisfactory to everybody involved and kind of emulates what you've seen in films. I'm sure that real gunfights like that were very rare, but we've seen them in movies, and we're going to want to do them in a game. So if the game doesn't have those rules, we'll just make them up. They become folklore. Now, sometimes they get written down, and sometimes they just kind of get there, just like what everybody just assumes that everybody knows how to do that in the game. Again, it becomes folklore. But if a game writes down all these rules, or as many of them as you can, because it's impossible to write them all down. It's a process of diminishing gains if you do that. Um, you can have a core set of rules which covers most common encountered experiences for your character. It's not going to cover everything. There will always be corner cases, but that's where the judgment of the DM or the GM and the players comes into play. But for the day-to-day tasks, in my opinion, a tabletop role-playing game should cover all of those things. And you should only have to judge the stuff that's outside that sphere of commonality. Some games write them down, like I've said, and some games don't. There are one-page RPGs out there. So they're assuming everything. All they're handing you is a bare bones mechanic. I mean, I've whipped up D6 dice pool games in my head on the spot because it was just a thing to do at the time. But along with that came years of experience on both my part and the person I was playing with. It was a solo game. So we had a lot of assumptions in our head already built in. We brought all the rules to the table, even if there weren't any rules written down. There were no mechanics recorded anywhere. But we all had in our heads a set of rules that we applied to the world that I had presented to them. It was a post-apocalyptic setting. This is why I like Pathfinder First Edition. Yes, it is a mess of rules, but those rules cover most common events your character is going to encounter in a high fantasy setting. And you only have to judge the corner cases, the things that don't quite fit into those rules. Now, you could try to simplify those rules. Lots of people have. But if you ask a dozen gamers, tell me which rules would you take out to make this game simpler, you get 13 answers. Heck, if you ask me once a month for a year, you might get 13 answers, depending on my mood at the time. But one of the rules I wouldn't take out is a trip attack, because that belongs in the very core of any game that uses polearms. I haven't even mentioned some of the Chinese martial arts weapons out there, and I haven't touched on deflexible weapons. So yeah, a trip attack belongs. But my assumption about that and 5th edition's assumption about that don't mesh. So when I hear someone say they're happy that a game is simpler, okay, there's fewer mechanics there in front of you. That doesn't mean there are fewer rules. And I prefer to have everybody looking at the same page, literally. If everybody's looking at page 68, we're all reading the same thing. Now, we may disagree with it. We may come up with a house rule based off of that. But at least we have a skeleton upon which to build a functioning house rule. We are not making it out of whole cloth. By basing it off of the same thing at every single table, whether they accept it, rule as written, or if they come up with the house rule, at least everyone will have a touchstone. And they go, okay, I see what you did there. The rule is this, and you went in this direction. Well, we kind of went in this direction, but I understand what you're doing there. You've created a language that we all can accept. You've provided us with all the assumptions we need to be able to communicate with each other. I'm reminded of something somebody once said. He was a pedant of the First Water, and he hated the concept of Florentine. Because in the SCA, if you say that, someone is fighting Florentine, it means a weapon in each hand. And his comment was always that Florentine is a type of egg. And then he used the Spanish term for fighting with a weapon in each hand. I don't remember what it is. One of you probably does. But I looked at him and I said, well, if I say that in a room full of gamers or a room full of SCA people, which is the Venn diagram of a circle, and I say the person's fighting Florentine, everyone in that room is going to understand what I mean. So while it may not be the, academically correct term, it's still communication. I am still conveying an idea from one person to the other, and we are all understanding what we're talking about. That's communication. And the closer we can get to that in a game, I think the better off we are. So by stripping out rules, you just make communication more difficult. It's kind of like if every single role-playing game table, every house table was using a different kind of math. So one group is doing math in base 10, one group is doing base 12, one group's doing it in base 3. So if the guy's doing it at base 3 and he writes 1-1, that's 4. But if I see 1-1, that's 11. We are no longer communicating properly. And that's what simple, to my mind, does. It obscures and what's the word I'm looking for? Obfuscates? I can never pronounce it. But you get the point. It just muddles the water. It makes things harder to understand, harder to communicate. And you're just going to have to come up with house rules to cover that. Because I got to tell you, if I'm in 5th edition and I say I want to do a trip attack and the GM looks at me and says there is no trip attack, I'm going to either say, okay, can you come up with one? And if the answer is no, okay, I'm going to go home now. Because you're not willing to support the type of game I want to play. You're telling me I can have that much fun. And I see a whole lot of that in both Pathfinder 2nd Edition and 5th Edition D&D. You can have that much fun. And you do not dare go outside that fun allotment. It is just not allowed. I don't like it. I read those 2 games and I felt like every time I turned around, I was smacking up against a wall. Ones that didn't exist in Pathfinder 1st Edition or 3.5. So I don't think there's any such thing as a simple game, a simple system. I don't think it exists. Doesn't matter how many mechanics you have, I still believe that we all bring the same number of rules to every single game we play. Sometimes you get lucky and you can find a whole bunch of people sitting on the same table and they all have the same assumptions and everything just moves smooth as silk. Sometimes you don't, because the rules are written down. I don't know how many of you have ever read the Palladium fantasy role-playing game when it was first released. Because when it was first released, I read it and it made me think of somebody's 2nd edition D&D game that had so many house rules tacked on it. Boom, 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 till it became a thing of its own. And that it was like you'd have to dig into the DNA of that house, that set of rules, all the way back through time till you finally saw the mechanic that has originally been 2nd edition D&D. Because that's what it felt like to me. 2nd edition D&D game with just so many house rules that it became a thing unto its own. And I don't want that at every table. Which is why I like games that I consider to be medium complexity, and I think Pathfinder 1st Edition is a medium complexity game. It's not an OSR system, and it sure as shooting isn't Hero. It falls in the middle in my book. And it's the sweet spot for me. And I'm not saying the sweet spot for you is wrong. You like 5th edition, game till the sun goes cold. But when I see something as glaring in 5th edition as missing out an option that should really be there, it makes me step back. It makes me question why they made that decision. Because a bunch of people sat around a table and picked apart every single rule in that game before it made it to print. And I can't imagine why somebody thought that was a good idea, to only allow fighters at high levels to be able to do trip attacks. That's baffling to me. There's no reason first level characters can't build a character around tripping your opponents. None whatsoever. That's completely viable in my book, because you're not doing other options. You've decided to focus yourself like that, then hell, let the person focus like that. There's nothing wrong with that. You can work around it. You can present challenges that all they're focused aren't going to be able to solve. So now they're going to have to come up with something else. You're God. You should be able to pull that off. All right, I've babbled long enough. So let's hear your opinions about this. specifically about the strip action. Do you think it belongs in 5th edition or not? Um, but also the whole concept of, can a game actually be simple? Can we actually strip out what we consider to be extraneous rules and still have a system that everyone at a table is speaking the same language, doing the same type of math? Because I don't think you can. I think when you get to a certain point, you're unable to talk to each other and you're unable to do what you want to because the game isn't letting you. And you're just going to end up with a bunch of haphazard house rules or inconsistencies. To me, that's worse than a game that is often been considered to be bloated with rules. I would rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it.